everybody. No connection to our material, that song. I just needed to hear that one today. That's one of the all-time greats, Jackie Wilson there. Higher and higher. La'ela, La'ela, right? Okay, there's your connection. Hey everybody, it's good to be here. I have to say, for me, it feels like a little oasis in the middle of this like high holiday desert. I feel like I'm not exactly done with the high holidays, you know, because there are more to come. But whew, what a time. We're out of the month of Elul. We spent the last few weeks studying our parshot. Some people say parshiot. I think it's parshot. Our parshot with an eye towards tshuva. And we're obviously deep in the tshuva process now. But actually, I just want to use this hour to just learn Torah. Like, forget about it for an hour. Like, let's just learn. Let's just be in learning that I need that as a little Wednesday breath in the middle of. It's like a, you know, tekiah and then like trua. Like there's something in the middle. There's got to be something in the middle. Okay. So we're going to talk about poetry today, the poetry that is found in the Torah, and I have to say I'm no expert in poetry, inside or outside of the Torah. So I'm not going to presume to teach you poetics and biblical verse style. There are some things that are obvious that we'll talk about. But we're not going to do that. In fact, we're not going to go through the whole poem today of Parshat Hazinu. Parshat Hazinu is mostly a poem. It's a poem that Moses recites, and what we're gonna do is figure out why Moses recites it. When Moses is told why all of a sudden is there this poetry towards the end of the Torah. It is the most significant sort of chunk or block of just sheer poetry in the Torah, save one earlier incident, which you can think about, but I'm sure some of you can guess. We'll see soon. But just take a look. Strangely, when all the websites that I go to get my Torah text do not list it. They just list it Hazinu like everything else. So I have to actually show you in a book. But this is tikkun here, what you study if you're learning to recite the Torah, and this is just a regular page in the tikkun, like, because this is the way the Torah looks inside these little columns, right, of narrative that just keep flowing, and there are two columns here on each page, but the Torah is just column after column, right? And then if I turn the page here, all of a sudden, Parshat Hazinu, I get this, okay? So it breaks up into two columns. And keep that in mind, because that's how that is how the poem is meant to be read. There's one phrase and then another phrase just across it. The columns in this case don't go. We don't read them down. Let's say Chinese style, but continue to read them across. So it's one line on one column and one line on the other, and then they're in dialogue with each other. We'll see that soon. Okay, but you can see Hazinu is a big poem with columns and columns. Here it goes on. There's the next page is like that, and then it stops because Hazinu is over, or actually stops towards the end. There's a couple of prose paragraphs. So, so I want to just like take some stock of this fact, this very prominent fact that there is verse in the Torah, that there's poetry in the Torah, and to ask what it's doing here. Now, first of all, how many folks here write poetry? Anybody write poetry? Great. Okay, so as I said, I'm no expert and I don't write poetry, so I'd love to bring in the voices of people who have real experience with this. So please feel like empowered to interpret and teach us all. But what I do want to do before we start to analyze verse is just like go back a little bit and get the history, brief history of poetry in the Torah, and then and then do what I feel a little more competent in, which is to look at narrative, to look at the narrative which introduces Hazinu and says some things about it. And then if we're lucky, we'll get to a beautiful, like a really stunning 19th century rabbi's thoughts on poetry. Okay, that's a lot to accomplish today. I'm both like less prepared than usual and also have like way more material. The two things go together. It's just like high holidays. I'm like, okay, here's everything that I thought about relationship to this class. So hopefully you can keep me a little bit on track and in order. But let's take a look now. I'm gonna give you a source sheet. So let me get that first. Let's take a look. And as I'm pulling this up, let me ask you, what is, I said this is the most significant chunk or block of poetry in the Torah, except for one other example. So what's that? Here's your source sheet. What's that one other example? Joe.
Song at the Sea.
Perfect. Song at the Sea. Okay, that's exactly right. That's back in Exodus in Parshat Beshalach when Pharaoh sent us out. And take a look. Look at Brandon Rabbit there. Hi, haven't seen you in a while. So nice to see you. Take a look at just how it is spoken of in the Torah, and notice also what Joe just called it, because it mirrors Hazinu in the sense that it has a kind of a form. In fact, before I even share this, let me do the same thing in the Tikkun here and show you. Now here's Hazinu, right? This poetic form. The Song at the Sea looks like this, right? So also different, but different in a different way. And there's lots that you can say about this, but the easiest thing that we might say was what does it look like? What is it maybe meant to look like? It maybe looks like the Israelites crossing the sea, right? There's a sort of scattered column in the middle here, and maybe they're going through so the form is clearly, I'm not saying it's clearly that, but the form is clearly intended. This pattern is meant to be part of the poetry, and we'll keep track of that. Okay, but let's just take a look at how that one is introduced, because that's the first time that the word shirah is used in the Torah. Az yishir Moshe v'nei Yisrael et hashirah hazot ladonai that's not good. Maybe later. Vayomru lemor ashira ladonai ki ga'o ga'a sus v'rochvo rama vayam. And we sing this every day, right? In davening. So some of you are familiar with it. There's the word. Then Moses and the Israelites. But what did they do in this translation and in Joe Schwartz's translation? What is a shirah?
A song.
A song. You know, the truth is, I didn't even give enough. It sounds like a mysterious question, but I'm asking it without giving the requisite information, which is that a shirah is our word for poetry, poem. Okay, that's true in modern Hebrew and it's true in biblical Hebrew. But whoever just shouted out song is absolutely right that the word is used as song here, and that's just because it's very difficult to distinguish between the two terms in ancient Hebrew. What is a poem and what is a song? Jody, you got some thoughts?
But don't they also use the same term when they're crossing the sea? And both, and I thought I heard you say that they only used it once they use it at the sea. And what about when Jacob is blessing his children?
So they don't use the word shirah, at least as far as I know, although look it up and prove me wrong. Happy to be proven wrong. And, but Jody's right that there is all kinds of, let's go back into this, these early, just sort of, this is just like early history of the idea of shirah.
There's shirah, right? And
there's a shirah in the book of Exodus. We just saw that. And then we also see the word used again in the book of Numbers, and it's a similar form. Az yashir Yisrael et hashirah azot. Then Israel sang this song. to a well, which has popped up. Same sort of form. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song. Then Israel sang this song. So, and there we don't get a whole, you know, a whole chunky column poem laid out before us. But we do have some idea that Moses sang a song before. The Israelites sang a song. Maybe so far we're just thinking of singing songs. But from the form of the song at the sea, we know that there's something poetic about it. I mean, I'm not even sure, I'm not sure how to parse the difference between the two usages of song or poem, because after all, the lyrics to a song are always a kind of poem, aren't they? Or maybe not. Right? But the term is a little blurry in Hebrew. Like, I will now recite a song / a poem. And that's true in modern Hebrew as well. We speak of poetry as shirah and also song as shirah. In modern Hebrew, we usually distinguish between a song as a shir and poetry as shirah, but it's pretty close and blurry. And when Psalm says shir lamalot, right, a song unto the heights, are they saying a song unto the heights or a poem unto the heights? Right? That term's a little blurry. Okay. But I want to just give you just one more piece here, and then I'll take some hands, which is that Jody correctly reminds us that, yeah, they might not use the word shirah before the Song at the Sea, but there's all kinds of verse in the Torah before then. Now, when I look at this copy of my Chumash, the first, they sometimes put things in verse. You see there down at the bottom. The first one I found here, actually, it's a little debatable, like what's in verse and what's not, because these verses they're calling poems just by indentation are not indented that way in the Torah. But the first one they do that for is in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, when Adam looks at Eve and says, "Vayomer Adam zot hapam etzem ma'atzmai uvasar mivsarai." This time it's bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Something kind of poetic about it, and this book turns it into a poem. So I don't know, like, we can find, and Jacob's blessing's another great place. And they do the same thing to God's curse for Adam and Eve, and they do the same thing to what God says to Cain. But I just want to give you one example, and the one that I think Robert Alter, who is sort of the expert on this today, Robert Alter has a book called The Art of Biblical Poetry, which, if you're interested in this subject, is the book, The Art of Biblical Poetry. And I think the first one that he really that he cites, although he also says it's debatable what the first poem is a kind of a strange, but this one really seems to be a kind of a verse recitation, a strange little parable or poem or something given by Lemech, one of the descendants of Cain. And I wanna just show it to you, not because we're going to spend much time analyzing it, but because the language here is so striking. And with this, we'll get into Hazinu, but look at what he says here. Lemech said to his wives, he had 2 wives, Ada and Zillah, "Hear my voice, O wives of Lemech, give ear to my speech. I have slain a man for wounding me, and a lad for bruising me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lemech 77-fold. So I have never really truly understood this. I don't know exactly what he's talking about, but he definitely seems to be speaking in a kind of a chant, a kind of a verse. And of course, when I went back, and I really didn't realize this until this morning, look at the language he uses. He said, "Vayomer lemech lenashav v'tzila sham'an, hear my voice. Hazena, give ear to my speech." And if you could just hear hazena right there is just the language that we will eventually see for hazinu, right? Hazinu hashamayim, give ear heavens, let the earth hear. So hazinu, at the very least, is calling back to the first instance of very clear biblical verse. Okay, so that's interesting. Like there is a tradition of poetry in the Torah, and I'm not like poetry, song, chant, rap, you know, like whatever. It's hard to even know how to find the right term, but it's called shira. Okay, that's just the backdrop. Now we're gonna head into it, but let's take some opening thoughts. Wendy.
I think we're talking about poetry. Poetry is something that has a rhythm, and intrinsic in it is its music. You know, what is music? Is it necessarily notes, melody? It's also rhythm. So poetry, but what really is dear to my heart, music is extremely powerful. And when we sing something, it sticks in our memory much stronger. And so much of Torah, so much of our liturgy is dealing with music. We talk about singing, we talk about instruments, and this is how we communicate even stronger to God when we utilize music. And I think so. When we talk about hearing, that's such an integral part of Judaism. Shema Yisrael, listen. Hearing is something that is constant. That's a constant, and what we're being reminded to do.
Right, it's Shema Yisrael, right? I mean, it's like right up at the, you know, it's like a very central activity. We heard the words at Sinai, right? They heard God walking in the garden, right? Listening, understanding, taking something in. That language is so, as Wendy says, so central to our whole religious experience that we see, the religious experience of the Torah. And I think Wendy's doing some good work here in trying to synthesize these two usages, poetry, song. What exactly is it? Could it be that all poetry has a kind of musicality to it? Might we say that because it's about the sound of the words and they are arranged in some kind of rhythmic form, that music is sort of, in some ways, a song and a poem are the same thing. Now that will be, we're gonna focus on poetry today, but that will be important for us because is part of what's important about poetry the song of it, the sing song of it, if you will, sound of it. And Wendy also kind of points us towards what this poem will be used for, which is as a kind of testimonial, a kind of, there's a kind of memory device that it is, that the poem of this week's Parsha will be meant to evoke. Okay, let's take the hands that are up, Noah and Yonatan, and then we'll head into, I see Payam as well. Noah, what's up?
Okay, that's a really good question. What differentiates a poem from a song? Because as was said, there are certain melodies that go when reading a poem. Like I remember hearing like some spoken verse at like an event, and I couldn't differentiate it from rap, from a song, because there was a certain melody and like a beat at everything to it. So does a song mean that we're like singing the words with a melody, with musical instruments, or is it just the spoken voice and the melody that comes along with speaking?
Yeah, right, good. For further ruminations on the ambiguity of different forms of recited verse. Yonatan?
I wanted to harp on something you said in response to Wendy, but I promise I'm doing it for a good reason. You said we heard the words at Sinai, and that's kind of true. We saw the words at Sinai, right, is what the Torah actually says. And I think that's a really interesting, that immediately brought to my mind a really interesting angle on all of this, especially the layout of the poetry, which is like all these different modes of accessibility for the words, for the message. We don't just hear it, we can see it, we can feel it. That's kind of the whole purpose of how all this is structured.
Yeah, great. Okay, that's a beautiful point, because after all, we're looking at a book here. Like, we don't have this is not music, these are words, but this is from an oral tradition, and there is a way of chanting these words. So I'm just thinking, as we see this is a visual, the Torah I think of as words, but there's a way also to hear the Torah. And those experiences, as Yonatan says, even in the Torah, are both present and blurring together as well. Payam.
There's also a different use of poetry in the sense that it denotes the speaker and their status. So in Shakespeare, if you look at Shakespeare, the upper class always speak in poetry versus the lower class are in prose. So, I mean, I think it's an interesting, different dynamic of viewing it as like something that's holier, the holiest would be in poetry in the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, and take note of the fact that Moses, I don't know who's more upper class in some ways than Moses, but Moses sings a song, right? The classic song. But the children of Israel also respond. They also say, everybody sings. Everybody in the nation is invited to recite, to sing together, right? And as we'll soon see, there's a kind of there's a part of the point of verse is to create a kind of a listening and reciting relationship between the leadership and the people of Israel. Okay, so it's going to serve a very public function which has a hierarchy but is accessible to all. Okay, so just there's a lot there. We'll get into it soon. All right, one last comment and then let's dive in. Leonard, how you doing, man? Good to see you.
I'm doing good, thank you.
Good.
Thanks for calling me. My first comment since
Yeah.
I have a slight different view than Wendy on what poetry is. But Wendy said poetry is always musical and sort of equating that. I really don't agree with that. I think that in modern times we have broken out of the constraints in which poetry had to be rhythmic, in which music has to be melodious. I'm a musician, so music doesn't need to be melodious, harmonious, or rhythmic. What is music is the same question as what is art and what is poetry. It's dependent not on the intrinsic material, but on the context and the intention. So the giant rock that's at LACMA, next to the Resnick Pavilion, is it just a giant rock, or because of the intention of putting it there, its placement, how we're invited to look at it, does it become art because of its context and its intention? And that's what I would argue with regard to these poems. It's not that it's so brilliant or that it's rhythmical or musical, it's that somebody intended it to have a kind of higher meaning to them. And of course, in these ancient times, really until just the last several hundred years, verse was always music. Verse was virtually never not sung. That's it.
Great. I love those thoughts. Especially the idea that part of what verse does is to consecrate speech, right? It's to give it like a kind of behold, and now I recite unto thee, the great, and actually, as you say that, I realize that everything that we know, fourscore and, we the people, like all of those classic incantations of a sacred script feel rhythmic to us. That's sort of, and so when you choose verse as a way of behold, and now I speak unto thee, that's part. Okay, Wendy has been directly referenced. I'll let you respond. Do you want to respond, Wendy?
Yes, thank you. Because I think it depends also. I think what you're saying, Lenny, is absolutely valid. I think it also, what do we define as music? Sometimes we can be in relationship and it feels like music. It's not music as quote unquote we define it with notes But even, and in modern times, we have John Cage, this phenomenal composer, who would go outside and listen to sprinklers going off, and that's music. Sound is music.
Okay.
That's where I'm coming from. Sound is music.
This is we've gone pretty deep now here on just the ambiguity of the word shira, and that'll be very useful to us. But let's now push forward because, I mean, this last debate is so interesting. Like, what does poetry exist independently of music? Is somehow a musicality embedded in poetry? All right, so let's think about that. How poetry is meant to be received, heard, chanted, sung, whatever, okay? But what I want to do before we actually look at a couple of verses from Haazinu is just to look at the context, because remember now that word shira has been used twice before in the Torah, at least by my reckoning. I don't know if someone's found a different usage. Twice before in the Torah, and then all of a sudden it pops up not in Parshat Haazinu, but we're going to go back a week to Parshat Vayelech. And in Parshat Vayelech, we come upon not just the word shira, but God's explicit command to Moses to write a poem. Did you know that? Because it's striking. God tells Moses to write a poem. Not just chant, by the way, write. Okay, so let's just take a look. We're going to need to do a little bit of a running start here, and I'll try to do it rather quickly. Okay, so back in Parshat Vayelech, here's the context. Right? Vayelech Moshe v'yedaber et hadavarim ha'ele el kol Yisrael. Now this is already, even this line is important. Moses went and spoke these words to all Israel. Well, that's a familiar thing, right? Moses speaking words to the people. But they're just words here, okay? So we can sort of keep track of how even that phrase is used. But what Moses said to them is, I'm 120 years old, and I can no longer be active, and God has said you can't cross the Jordan. So Joshua is the one who's going to cross before you. You know, and then this famous phrase, Chazak v'amatz, chizku v'imtzu, be strong and resolute, be not in fear. God's going to be. Okay, so this is the context. Moses is about to die. He's 120 and he's about to die. And this is what Moses says. So he calls over Joshua and says this is his official appointment of Joshua. He's already named Joshua as his successor, but this is his official sort of handing over, literally handing, right? Because he's going to place his hand, handing over the reins. Moses called Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, be strong and resolute, chazak ve'amatz, for it is you who shall go with this people into the land that the Eternal swore to their fathers to give them. It is you who shall apportion it to them, and the Eternal will go before you. God will be with you. God will not fail you or forsake you. Fear not and be not dismayed. Okay, great. Now, this is just interesting because this language is very prominent, present here, and we're not yet at the poetry piece, but there's some other kind of writing that is also taking place here. Moses wrote down this Torah, V'yichtov Moshe et haTorah hazot, and gave it to the priests, sons of Levi, who carried the Ark of Eternal's covenant, and to all the elders of Israel. Now, what did Moses, let's just stop there for a second. What did Moses write down there? The Torah? What did Moses write down? I must, just to be fair, must say some translations say Moses wrote down this teaching, because Torah could always, it literally means a kind of a teaching, instruction. But I always feel like it says Torah, like it translated as Torah, that's our word for it. So what do you think Moses is writing down at that point? It's a little speculative, but what exactly do you, any thoughts on, Jody?
The book of Deuteronomy. I mean, he's got one speech, one really long speech, and he's repeating the law.
Beautiful. That I think is a great answer. Maybe the best answer. Moses has been talking all along. That's Deuteronomy itself is Moses's words, right? Hadvarim, these words that Moses recited. And so Moses probably wrote it all down, right? You might say Moses wrote down the 5 books of Moses, right? That might be or you might say that Moses wrote down this little piece here, whatever God just said, the handing over ceremony, whatever it is. But I think I like Jody's answer. All right, but let's just take a look then. Moses has written something down, and then Moses says, And Moses instructed them as follows. This is the mitzvah of hakel, which if you don't know about is just a great mitzvah to know about. Moses instructed them as follows. Every 7th year, the year set for a mission at the Feast of Booths, meaning on Sukkot in the sabbatical year, when all Israel comes to appear before the eternal your God in the place that God will choose, you shall read this Torah aloud in the presence of all Israel. Okay? So Moses writes the Torah down. Then Moses says, every 7 years, I want you to gather literally the entire nation and recite the Torah to them. Gather the people, men, women, children, strangers, everybody, so they may hear and learn to revere the eternal your God and to observe faithfully every word of this Torah. Now, I mean, at this point, it sounds like maybe it's more than what Jody said. Like it's starting to sound like maybe Moses is just, for Deuteronomy is just conscious of itself, or Moses is saying the whole tradition. I'm writing down the whole tradition. Their children too, who have not had the experience, shall hear and learn to revere the eternal your God as long as they live in the land that you're about to cross the Jordan to possess. So there's writing going on here. Moses writes a Torah, and Moses announces this ceremony to recite the Torah every 7 years to everybody. Everybody gathers, and it's like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and just on and on. Like, you know how long it takes to recite one parsha of the Torah on Shabbat? The whole Torah. Okay. Why do you think? Why that mitzvah? I mean, this is. I don't want to get too far off track here, but since it's a mitzvah of gathering and listening, why? Why would we want to hear the Torah every 7 years? Lila.
It's not a totally fully formed thought yet, but I think that something is being established here. Like just the fundamentals of like who we are as a people. So we're going to do what we're going to do. Like we're going to be acting in the world. And it's a kind of like colloquial existence. We're going to forget God and fight wars and just do. And the Torah like starts out by saying, you know, God created the world through speech. So we're given a model for a kind of like speech is, and this kind of elevated or slanted or different or wholly meaningful speech it means something to us as a people. And I think this whole thing around writing and hearing it, and it's, I don't know, it just becomes like the essence of who we are, like being like God, you know. Anyway, I'm rambling because I'm just forming it.
No,
but
that's good rambling. That's good rambling. There's something powerful about the way you're framing this. This is like, it is the recitation of our tradition out loud that helps to kind of form us, cohere us, bind us as a people. Otherwise, we're just people. But there's something about like, we take in the same, it's like standing up for a national anthem or something, but it's more than that. It's like the recitation of our whole culture. And there's like a kind of that every 7 years, if we forget, and Lila, you're already on to something. Very soon we're going to hear exactly that worry that the people, remember, the context is Moses is dying, the people are going to be on their own. And now there's all this talk of writing down and reciting. We didn't need that before because Moses was around. Mm-hmm. So, and they needed some kind of formal, Baruch Hu et, right? Like something that calls us all to attention. Okay, I see lots of hands up now. And we haven't even gotten to the command to recite poetry. So I'm just going to take a few of them. So pardon me, I'm going to take a few and then we're going to go back in. So keep your hands up. I'm sorry if I missed your thought in time. But Hal or Kathy.
So it occurs to me, I mean, there is no alternative for hearing the Torah when this commandment or mitzvah is. I mean, it's, there's no place in the Torah that says, once a week you go to shul and you hear part of the Torah. I mean, that doesn't come until a lot later. So there's just like, there's no other institution or practice when this is handed down that provides for that. So in addition to not forgetting, I mean, it's just kind of, anyway, so.
Yes, this will be necessary to preserve a tradition in the way that we think that Torah reading in our shuls preserves a tradition. But first of all, it's every 7 years. And secondly, they have another mechanism for preserving. The first thing that Moses does, which is writes it down. So it's just so interesting that it's not like, great, now we've got the book. Like, no, now we also need chanting, right? And we think of that as like a later institution, but there's something about that goes all the way back. Susan.
It's that it's usual. It's not, it's both kept special, but it's also something you do all the time. You do it. You don't hide it. You keep doing it.
Is it all? Are you also saying that there's something that's like, it's about like you chant it and now it's public?
Yeah, you just instead of hiding it. Sometimes I think of some of the ways in which others use the Bible. We don't have it like that. We live it. We say it all. We read it all. It's part of our world. It's part of our lives.
Yeah. Now that's the interesting thing, right? What gets chanted, right? And Susan is saying, well, everything, right? Like we're about to think of a particular chanting of a particular poem, but we know, and the Torah seems to say, actually everything that we consider Torah will be chanted, cantillated, spoken out loud. That's interesting as well. All right, we're coming down towards the end of the hour, and this has been such great work, but I don't want to leave you without ever getting to the poem. And I also don't want to leave you without getting to this interesting moment, which is where God says, now remember, Moses wrote the Torah down, and Moses said, listen to the Torah. But God says something different. Check it out. God says, the Eternal said to Moses, time is drawing, like it's almost a repetition. Moses said, I'm going to die. And then the Eternal's like, yeah, you are. Call Joshua, and I may instruct him. And Moses and Joshua went into the tent. And then God says, the Eternal said to Moses, you're soon to lie with your fathers. The people will then go, this is Lila's worry here. The people will then go astray after the alien gods in their midst. In the land they are about to enter. They will forsake me and break my covenant that I made with them. I gotta say, God's a very anxious character, right? God's already stressed out. The people are gonna leave, they're gonna abandon me. Now that you're not here, I'm as worried as anyone else that these people are just not, eventually they're gonna not just get lazy, but worship other gods. Then my anger will flare up against them. I will abandon them and hide my face from them. This is very strong language, right? Histarti panai, I will hide, hester panim, I will hide my face from them. It's like thought to be one of the great sort of expressions of what it's like to be in the world and feel without God. And they shall be ready prey, and many evils and troubles shall befall them, and they shall say on that day, surely it is because our God is not in our midst that these evils have befallen them. Yet I will keep my face hidden on that day because of all the evil they've done in turning out. Very big bummer here, gotta say. Like Moses is leaving and God's like, it's all just going to hell. And then God says, now therefore, therefore write down this poem and teach it to the people of Israel. And I'm going to translate it as poem here. We could obviously translate it as song. It's not clear what it is, but it's the chapter before Hazinu. So it seems pretty obvious that it's Parshat Hazinu. It seems. But that's the way it seems, but it's going to get a little more confusing than that. Put it in their mouths in order that this poem may be my witness against the people of Israel. Right? Tieli Ashira Zot Le'aid, a witness, Vivnei Yisrael. Not necessarily against, a witness upon them. When I bring them in the land flowing with milk and honey that I promised on oath to their fathers, and they eat and fill and grow fat and turn to other gods and serve them. Again, God's worried about that, spurning me and breaking my covenant. And the evils and troubles befall them. Then this poem shall confront them as a witness. Right? It's really interesting. What does it mean? The poem shall be a witness, since it will never be lost from the mouth of their offspring. For I know what plans they're devising. God stressed out again. Before I bring them into the land that I promised them on oath. On that day, Moses wrote down this poem, same language. V'yichtov Moshe et Torah, up here, Moses wrote down the Torah. And now, on that same day, Moses wrote down this poem, And then he charged Joshua again, be strong and resolute, da da da. And then the next verse here, 2 verses later, when Moses had put down in writing the words of this Torah to the very end. Wait, what? Now, you following that? Moses talks about writing down a Torah, reciting a Torah. God talks about writing down a poem and reciting a poem, and Moses writes the poem, and then suddenly Moses is talking, or the Torah is talking about it as if, yeah, all that, the Torah. So it's a little bit blurry here.
Not just the song, but the whole Torah.
I mean, it says that here, right? Moses wrote down the poem and then charged Joshua. And then it said when Moses is put down in writing the words of this Torah to the very end. Now, maybe this is separate. Moses is writing 2 separate things, or maybe this is a shift in the narrative. But like there's a little bit of a switching back and forth, and it keeps going because then Moses, look at what it says here. Moses had put down in writing the words of the Torah to the very end, and at the very, Moses goes on, I'm going to be dead. Last line of Parshat Vayelech, then Moses recited the words of this poem to the very end. Same language there, in the hearing of the whole of the congregation of Israel. Okay, so let's stop here, even though our precious time is dwindling away, and ask, what is going on? Moses writing down a Torah, God says to write down a poem. The poem's supposed to be a safeguard against some future time when the people have lost sight of God. And then Moses writes down the poem and the Torah and recites the poem. But what? Are they the same thing? What's the poem? I mean, maybe Hazinu is the poem, but what's going on? All right, let's hear from the voice that we haven't heard yet. Israel.
Yeah, I'd like to connect this to Hakel and this idea of, maybe the whole Torah is the poem, the big poem. It's the experience. When you hear a song, like when you played that Madonna tune weeks back, I just went back to a certain point in time. I was reliving it, right? So song taking us back to shared communal experience. And I think that's my understanding of, that's how I'm reading and understanding this, that really God is like, wow, you've been bound by these powerful, painful, traumatic liberation experiences. Don't forget me. Don't forget our bond and our connection once you're scattered in the milk and the honey of Eretz Yisrael. Remember those feelings we had together and you were bound by the desert and our togetherness. So, maybe every time that Hakel happens or every time you hear all of Torah, it should be like a song that evokes those feelings of the relationship with God and with each other as a community.
I love that connection, and I want to know more about how it works, what God is saying. Imagine God speaking in response to Moses's suggestion that let's all gather and recite this. This will have that kind of power, that bonding power when we all recite the Torah together. And then God says, yeah, what you really, I'm not sure, is God saying much the same thing, but think of it as a poem? Or is God saying, no, what you really need is a compact poem that really delivers the message? Or is God building on Moses' idea? Or is there something separate well, wait a minute, recite the whole Torah? That sounds a little tiresome. Maybe you need a powerful, jam-packed poem. So I'd like to hear more about what's the 1-2 here? How is God as Issa suggests so beautifully, in dialogue with Moses' suggestion that we all hear the poem recited? Joni?
It was an earlier
I'm sorry.
Note on, I think he says Hazet. Somehow it was just that phrase that struck me rather than the entire Torah. That every 7 years, it seemed very particular, do not forget these words. They'll need to hear that.
Yeah, okay, great, Joni. That's very good reading, because Joni notes that it's always, almost all the usages of either Torah or poem in this passage are punctuated with this very one. And the word is hazot. V'yichtov Moshe et Torah hazot. This Torah, right? And tikra, call out et HaTorah hazot. All the words of this Torah, HaTorah hazot, which begs the question, what Torah? This allows for maybe it's this very part of the Torah, this section right here, right? And then the same thing with the poem. right? Write down this poem, right? Shira Hazot. And Moses wrote down Shira Hazot. So there is something broad being said here about recitation, but there's also something about this very formulation that seems specific as well. Okay, so thanks for that. That's another good clue. Marlene?
You know, the psychologists remind us that most people can only remember between 5 and 7 things on a list. And so to think that all of the entire people of Israel are going to remember the entire Torah is problematic. So I'm going back to what you said about having a short form, that if there's not a short form that reminds us what the big Torah is about, you know, we have to have it every 7 years, because it would be impossible to think that everybody would remember everything in the Torah. And it's not reasonable. Are they going to walk around every day, you know, reciting the entire Torah? It's just
Right.
it's not practical.
Right.
And so every 7 years we get the whole context. And the other thing is we get pieces along the way. So even in a, you know, as synagogue practice develops, you hear a parsha, but you don't get the context, the nice things that you're providing for us in this class, for example. So every 7 years, you make sure you have the whole context, but you have these short ways of connecting to the meaning of what the Torah is for the people of Israel.
Great. And that's beautifully put. And I think, you know, it says something also about what poetry might be. One of the things that it is a condensing of words. Words carefully, we think of the words of the Torah as carefully chosen, but with poetry, the words are precise. There's no extra word. The idea is every word is chosen, and so it's kind of like, it's a little bit like Yigdal, the song that we sing at the end of a lot of our services. Yigdal is a song that expresses the 13 principles of faith that Maimonides wrote down in prose and in long, dense prose, these ideas that we're supposed to keep in mind. But if you could just sort of like sing the 13 verses, then you kind of keep them in mind. It's with you, right? That you have like a compact, a condensed form. Okay, will we never get to poetry itself? Let's get to it now. And we're, you know, this is, I admit already, this is a little bit of bait and switch, because we're only going to look at a couple lines, because again, it's a long poem, first of all, and I'm not a poetry expert, but I do want to take a look at the poem. Just as we leave off, though, from the context, I want to mention a beautiful piece of Talmud that suggests that when God says this, exactly what Joni knows, it's this poem, what is God talking about? And of course, the first opinion in the Talmud is that God is talking about Parshat Hazinu, right? The one that's coming up. But take a look at this little piece in Masechet Nedarim that gives us a little quiet debate, but it actually ends up having like a powerful position on one side. Now, therefore, write this poem for you, right? That's what we just read in Deuteronomy. This refers to the poem itself, meaning Hazinu, that's coming up. But then it's a little hard to read, but then there's a disagreeing voice in the Talmud. It says, wait a minute though. You're claiming it only refers to Hazinu, but then it says, this poem should be a witness for me among the children of Israel. Now, that as a rejoinder is understood to mean that this opinion is that the poem is the Torah. God is, and this is sort of a beautiful idea, but we've seen how it has some basis in the text. God is seeming to be talking about the same thing Moses is talking about, but God wants to call the Torah a song, a poem, right? Write down this poem. So in other words, the Torah is the poem, right? That's one opinion of the Talmud. So just let's keep that blurriness that like on the one hand, there's something distinct about Parshat Hazinu, but on the other hand, there's something about what Parshat Hazinu is and its introduction that tells us that we should sort of think of all of the Torah this way, right? Whether we take that opinion in the Gemara seriously, it expresses an idea that there's a kind of, it's not so clear from this back and forth from Torah to poem, which is which, and maybe it's not supposed to be so clear. Okay, let's take a look at Parshat Hazinu, just so we don't talk about poetry the whole time and not see any. And we're just going to look at a couple lines, but I just want you to see kind of what's going on here, just in the opening. Just how does Moses talk? Right? Hazinu hashamayim ba'adabeira. I should probably chant it, right? Hazinu hashamayim ba'adabeira, v'tishma haaretz imrei fi, yarov kamatar likhi, tizal katal imrati, kisirim ale deshe, kirvivim ale esev. Right? That's the chant. That's the poem. Give ear, O heavens, let me speak. Let the earth hear the words I utter. Now, just want to pause there. Not obviously that's very dramatic and ta-da. And as I said before, similar language to the very first poem that we noted in the Torah. Give ear, hear my voice. Okay, so there's some kind of callback. There's another callback here, by the way. What's the most obvious callback? Give ear, heavens, listen, earth. I want to shout out, what are the heavens and the earth referring to?
The creation story.
That's right. Just the first line of the Torah, right? God created the heavens and the earth. So Moses is sort of in dialogue here with God, or with the heavens and the earth. And the important thing just to note, and I'm no poetry expert, we can say at least one thing. Remember, this is supposed to be on one side and this on the other side, or more properly, this is on this side and this is over here. So what this whole poem is a series of couplets divided by space. And in each of the units of the couplet, the same basic idea is expressed. Not always tightly, but look, give ear, O heavens, let me speak, right? Give ear, hear, heavens, earth, let me speak the words I utter. So they're similar, but of course they're also very different. There's heavens and earth, those are two different things. Give ear and hear are two different things, right? And so it is for the rest of the poem. May my discourse pour down like the rain, my speech drop down like the dew, like storm showers on shrubs, like droplets on the grass. Okay, so that is just just a taste of what's going on in this poem. Okay, so that just gives you a little more to work with when I ask the question, okay, so what just happened? What did Moses start doing? What is, now you've seen the flow of it, right? Where Moses is writing down the Torah. God tells Moses to write down the poem. Then, and Moses had this idea of reciting the Torah, but instead what Moses recites to the people is this one of his final acts is this poem. Why? What happens here? What is Moses doing? And the big winding question here, but what was God wanting Moses to do? Because remember, this poem is meant to be some kind of safeguard. What Moses is reciting now will be chanted throughout the generations. Okay, a lot here, and we only have a few minutes, but let's hear from some folks we haven't heard from yet. David.
Wow.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, everything's everything else. Think about songs. There's certainly songs have evolved to where we have choruses. Things keep coming back. We sing songs often. I mean, the difference between prose and poetry is the mystery. There's a mystery. There's something else in there, and I think that's what God is kind of saying. And besides what is inherent in songs of the repetition and other resonances, the melody, whether you're high or low, major, minor, all the things that are in songs and poetry, they all resonate with each other. The best thing I take away from this, though, is that we have a God. I mean, he talks about other gods. We have a God who likes music and he likes art and poetry, and that's something that the Jewish people have taken to heart.
Oh, I love that. What a beautiful thing to say. We have a God who loves poetry, right? A God who loves art. I love that. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. But yeah, I think you called out another important word here, which is the mystery of poetry. The sense of poetry as a very intentionally elusive, unknowable, interpretable, precise, but imprecisely understood thing. And isn't that, after all, the Torah? Isn't that, after all, what we think of God itself? Something, right? Maybe, and and with this, we start to head towards the end here, but maybe poetry is the only way we can ever talk about God, right? If David is right. If poetry is the only way, it evokes, we can't actually describe God. So maybe we're just evoking. Maybe that's what we. Okay, let me take one comment, and then I want to read you one last thing. Allison's had a hand up for a while.
Hey, this is a really short comment, but I love what has been said here so far. And I've been thinking about how we also have the Jubilee year every 7 years. And it's just so interesting. It seems like in Judaism, we have these series of cycles kind of nestled into each other. And I was thinking about how, the Jubilee year sounds really cool when I read it from the outside, but it must be actually difficult in practice to do that, to cancel all debts, to set slaves free, that it's a big shifting. And so maybe we need some kind of a condensed version of the Torah to give ourselves that kind of strength to do that in some sort of a way.
Yeah. I mean, I'm liking the idea that's surfaced here, and now that Allison is echoing that there's a recitation of the Torah, and that's good. But it happens. Right, this is like a building of like Esther's comments, Marlene's comments. There's a primary recitation, but it's only so often. We need a thing that's like keeps us in that spirit, in that awakening, in that whatever it is that the Torah is supposed to evoke for us.
Yeah.
There's so many. Yeah, you want to?
Oh, I just wanted to say in the chat that Noah observed that also the 7 weeks from Omer, like counting the Omer from Pesach. And Todd pointed out that the Jubilee is actually every 50th year, but the Shemitah is the 70th.
Right, the Shemitah, where there is still a release. So yeah, your point is taken. There's so many hands up. This is such a good topic. I wish we could talk about it forever. I do want to, and I'll certainly stick around after this, but I do want to at least read you this incredibly, I don't know exactly where to end this, so I might as well at least end it with this incredibly beautiful piece that was written by one of the great Torah commentators of the 19th century, Rev. Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv, they called him, last great Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva of Volozhin. And in his introduction to his commentary, which is one of the great works, it's called Ha'emek Davar, recommend it. He references this verse right down this poem, and he references the piece of Talmud that intimates that the poem being referred to here is the Torah itself. And then he goes on to say, well, now why would we call the Torah a poem? And you have already said some beautiful things, but here's another incredibly beautiful thing from a 19th century voice. We still have to understand, he says, how could the whole Torah be called a poem? Surely it's not written in the language of poetry. Rather, right, it's not all in verse. Rather, the answer, he says, is that the Torah has in it the nature and the richness of poetry, right? Teva viskulat hashira. It's a little bit like the nature and the richness, the treasure of poetry. For the Torah speaks in a fragmented language. And last week we studied the binding of Isaac, right? What a fragmented story. What a skeletal story that nevertheless evokes so much. And it's well known to anyone who studied that this language of fragments is very different from the language of prose. So there's something about the way the Torah talks that's inherently poetic. In a poem, he says, the idea is not fully explained the way it is in prose. Right? David's comments here echoing in the Netziv. And so one has to look at it sideways. You have to make little sideways analyses, saying that one rhyme means this and another rhyme means that. And that's not just creative interpretation. And the word he uses here is drush. That's not just drash, midrash. That's simply the nature of poetry. You think midrash are just like fancy rabbinic ways of spinning the Torah out of control? No, it's poetry. You're supposed to interpret it this way. This is the nature of the whole Torah as well, whose stories are not fully explained. Rather, one has to make insights and explanations based on the intricacies of the language. And this is not just creative interpretation. On the contrary, this is the most basic way to understand the verses, through midrash, because it's poetry. We're almost done here. In poetry, there's also a richness that comes from it having been adorned with all kinds of hints in a way that isn't done with prose, like the custom of using the first letter in each line to spell out the alphabet or to write out the poet's name. There is a richness that's special to this fragmented language and not to prose. All of the artwork, the craft that goes into poetry. Now, this is so powerful, how he ends. So it is exactly with the whole of the Torah, all of it. Aside from the most basic, simple reading, there is in every word many secrets and hidden ideas. Because of this, there are many instances when the language of the Torah is not to be read literally. Wow. And this is not, right? And all of this is not true for the Holy Torah alone, but with all sacred scripture. I'll leave it on that note. Yeah. That's something to think about. Something to think about. All right. I'll stick around for another few minutes. I'd love to hear more thoughts. Let's just see if anyone didn't get a chance to speak yet. Rachel.
I was just thinking back to like when he talks about, and I don't want them to turn to other gods, not necessarily like, well, I was reading about the witch of Endor last night, so I know that they're like, are pagans in the land, but I was thinking this idea of like, well, it's not like the Jewish people we never went back to like the golden calf. I started thinking about the idea of like, but there is a fear of like, what do we worship that isn't real? What then are we going to prioritize? And I think that that's like the way that we fall away from God, not worshiping a golden calf, but like worshiping and valuing the wrong things. So something that I was just kind of taking from that is not like, oh, they're going to go become pagans, but like there is a Hindi phrase, like take me from the unreal to the real. And then just in the immediate lines being about like land and earth, that's so much more concrete than like desire and promises and just like all these things we think about this time of year, and like what is actually real and how can we be brought back to like more love and compassion, not necessarily this is a very fragmented thought, but just kind of looking at the idea of like false gods, but not in like the way we worship things, just in the way we sometimes like lie to ourselves and like aren't our best selves. And how do we bring ourselves back with teshuvah? Like he's like, I want them to return to me. And then essentially that's what we are doing each year. It's a returning, not necessarily like a worship style thing.
Good. Okay, beautiful. First of all, thank you for doing my work for me and connecting this to the high holidays. But yes, there is some idea that words can bring people back to God. Words can remind them of what is true in the world, and they're good and they're sacred. And I just kept thinking while you were talking, as opposed to worshiping pagan gods or rocks and idols, and that there's something about our tradition, and people are uncomfortable with it sometimes. There's something about worshiping words. And that's actually okay in a way that worshiping things is not. Sometimes we get uncomfortable that people don't like, we dance around with the Torah, worship the Torah, we get so hung up on every little word, but there is actually a word which is like God, real but somewhat intangible. That's okay to revere. Whereas like an idol of God, no. So there's something deep happening there as well. Let's see, Jamie.
I'm not going to bring my dark theology in today.
Thank you.
Don't worry about that. I think I just want to kind of say what everyone else has said. I think that poetry captures like the emotional essence of something, an experience usually. And we often, we have this amazing gift as humans of metaphor, and that we just naturally reach for metaphor when we want to capture the true heart of an experience. So, we'll say things like, I'm starving, when I'm not actually starving, but I want you to get the sense of how hungry I am right now. And then I'm just looking at these words and of this poem, and I wish we'd spent a little bit more time with the poem. I hope that I hope everyone finds the time to read it. Just the power of this part where he says, when the Most High gave nations their homes and set the divisions of man, he fixed the boundaries of peoples in relation to Israel's numbers. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his own allotment. He found him in a desert region, in an empty, howling waste. He inverted him.
Wasteland, right?
What?
A howling wasteland.
A howling waste. He engirded him, watched over him, guarded him as the pupil of his eye.
It's beautiful stuff.
Yeah, it's just.
And by the way, that empty, howling wasteland is, the word there is tohu, chaos. It's only used in one other place, which is the opening verses of the Torah, right? So Moses is doing something here. Moses is a poet, and Moses is calling back. Moses is using the Torah to make new Torah. Right? All right, just a couple more thoughts here, if people can stick on. Lee.
Yeah, thanks for this. This was a great. I actually have a question more about the last thing that we read from that the head of from the head of the I forget if you said Yeshiva. What? Thanks. From the head of Emek Devar, that he said this is all to be read like poetry. There are parts of the Bible that there are parts of it they're like poetry, should not be taken literally. How is that received at the time? Like in his circumstances, because that, I mean, I love the sentiment of all of it and it's beautiful. It also seems kind of radical in certain in traditional settings.
Yeah, and I must admit, I'm probably even translating it more radical than it sounds. It's like she'eno meduyak kol kach. It's not exact. It's not to be taken literally, is the way I translate. But it doesn't have that same English connotation of like, this isn't real. But so I will say that the Emek Devar, his commentary was controversial because he was willing to talk about analysis of text, and he was willing to talk about modern science and ideas and even politics. So there's something to his boldness here, but I don't know if he meant, oh, we don't have to take this literally in the way that that might sound in English. But I will just tell you, and thank you for zeroing in on it. I will just tell you that it's so powerful for me, and maybe I did translate it the way I'd like to hear it, because I think this is a perfect expression of what I mean when I say that, like, I believe that the Torah is true, or truth, right? Like, I'm so uninterested in the question of like whether there was, a flood, it's like, this is, or was there an Adam and Eve, for God's sake? It's like, that so clearly is poetic to me. It's so patently a poem that's meant to express something so elusive and so far beyond what prose can express. So yeah, it's not literal in the way that prose is literal, but it's true. It's the truth of poetry, and and we need poetry to get to some of the deepest truths of all.
I love this in that way too, and I love that the idea of like midrash as commentary on poetry, and it's such sort of like a nicely fitting explanation and sort of in line with how to read a sacred text, and people in modern days like taking pieces of pop culture or books that they love and writing commentary on it or expanding on different ideas. Feel very emotionally real. Yeah.
I want to give just the last word to Lila, who is in fact a poet, who in fact writes in dialogue with the Torah. So I think it's fitting maybe that you take us out.
Thank you. I just wanted to offer that there's this form of twin cinema poem. So you have two columns and they can be read down or across. And so when you said before, like, just letting everybody know, like, this is how this is read. It's not read down like I think if we kind of step back and don't assert anything there is that kind of ambiguity is sort of like the model for reading. And I think that we do love intertextuality, in Jewish study, and we love to talk across time and space. And I think if the Torah is a poem, then when we look at it visually in this way, it's giving us on another level, like, this is how to understand this, which is to say, like, it's not to be understood one way or another.
So thank you so much. That's such a beautiful closing thought, because I think I hear in your poetic descriptions of how to read something very similar to mystical understandings of how to read, right? Like when the Emek Davar is saying, look at it sideways, see hidden clues, and like, that's not exactly what you're saying, but it's something similar to like, let the rules go. And just like, there are many ways you might read this. Like part of what we mean when we say that the Torah is a poem is, yeah, I just love what you suggested. I said, read it like this, but maybe you read it down. Maybe you read it backwards. Maybe like, who knows what the possibilities are endless. And that's also part of what I think the Emek Davar is saying here and what you're saying so beautifully about the idea of the Torah as a poem. All right, we better stop there. Thank you, everybody. This is so wonderful. Join us, if you will, for Yom Kippur, right? But we will have Shabbat services this week also. Yom Kippur starts on Sunday night. And all in between, let me just tell you that I am I'm very excited to have put together this 10 Sites of Awe, which is a kind of an outdoor activity and a way of engaging in the tshuva process sort of with the city. So these are 10, here I'm putting it in the chat. I think you have to do HTTP or something. Somebody do that right for me. But anyway, there's a website, and it's a way, I think, for us to interact out in the world without having to actually like breathe on each other. And like each of these sites has little QR codes. Like there's a whole interactive activity that is meant to be fun, but also a way of really engaging in some of the core issues that that are in our city. So lots going on this week. Tashlich, I think there's no formal gathering, but there's Tashlich at the beach tonight. Yeah, we're looking for ways to actually be in the world and activate you. But of course, online is great too. This has been great. Thank you so much for this hour. It does so much good to me. Good night, good afternoon, goodbye.
Incredible.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you. Everyone have a meaningful Shabbat Shuvah.
You too. Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Noah,
Thank
you
you.
too.
Amen.